You settle into a comfy spot, grab the remote, on they come, the Olympics. We don't get them very often, but it's a good time to see the world's best doing their thing. But the first words out of the announcer's mouth is, "It is so hot." Welcome to What Is It About the Weather? A podcast where we explore the many ways that weather intertwines itself into our lives. I'm your host, Mark Jelenic, and this week, as I play with a microphone set up, we're going to be talking about the Olympic weather in a bit more detail. But before I get there, hope you've been having a good weather week. Mine's not been too bad. Some warm, some cold, but all in all, pretty reasonable. I actually had some days where for the middle of summer, I know technically it depends on which summer you're talking about, but, relatively middle of summer, was able to open some windows and enjoy some comfortable temperatures, and don't often get a chance to do that. So I was grateful, particularly after the travels where I had some, I would say, warm weather. But again, summertime, should expect that, right? And so should they in the Olympics, right? All right, we'll get to that. I wanted to take a moment. I had a good conversation this week, caught up with a friend of mine who I worked with for many years, and he's embarking on a new adventure in his career, and I just want to wish James the best of luck. It was good to chat with you, and as always, I enjoy our conversations that always at some point also get into some weather topics that we find interesting. And he brought up something related to overnight temperatures, and may not mean much to you, but in the context of things that he's working on that I've worked on in the past with him, makes a lot of sense, kind of like me talking about, wet bulb temperatures and those sort of things. But it points out that all of us folks who work in the weather world see things through, a set of eyes, and it's important that we do talk from time to time, and that's one of the reasons I do miss, you can have a conference all you want virtually, but it doesn't spark the same kind of conversations that you might have just hanging out with people. And I do think that's important. So hopefully we'll get to be doing more and more of that. Although with the rate things are going, who knows? Who knows? Any case, again, James, good luck. And speaking of like career type stuff, I saw on LinkedIn, right? And I don't know about you, but we all get notifications for every social network we work with, whether it's Facebook, which, I've kind of turned off in my world. Occasionally I still get some sort of notification from there, but I've essentially taken my profile out of there. But whether it's Instagram or even other focused ones like Strava, where, it's about athletics and the social connection, constantly, all day, or even Twitter now is trying to guess what I want to watch or see. And I'll tell you, Twitter, not doing a very good job. And actually, it's to the point where it's annoying. And, you have to turn those features off because your guesses aren't even close. You think you understand me. You think you understand what I want. But nah, you're not doing a particularly good job, which might have something to do with why you continue to struggle. I like your platform. Still do. I still think it's one of the best for sharing pictures and video and text, all in a format that works. But, if you maybe could guess better, you might have me a little more often. In any case, one that I had not until recently been getting barraged with notifications is LinkedIn. And I will tell you, that one's also a bit bizarre and annoying in some level. It's like, why am I getting notifications on LinkedIn for these certain types of things? I think of LinkedIn as a professional platform, a professional networking platform. And I realize that the goal with all these things is to make money and to, for the company to get something in return out of it. And actually, in some ways, their suggested stuff that they throw at me is meaningful, but it's not necessarily what I really want, right? But every so often, and they keep trying different techniques. A lot of times it's notifications on my phone. For a while, I didn't even know I had, it came pre-installed on my phone. I didn't even know I was logged into it there, and I started getting notifications. But I got an email the other day. It had some summary things from my feed. And again, I'm kind of okay with that. It's like a once a week snapshot or even once a day, and I could choose to ignore it or not, but I flipped through it. And what was interesting was not, what their goal was. What was interesting is something that really irritated the heck out of me Okay. And it had to do with a forecast. And I'm going to not get into a soapbox episode because I could lose a whole entire episode on something I saw put in LinkedIn without any context around it that was issued as a forecast. Now, I hope for everybody involved that this forecast turns out to be credible. It was a 1 month look. Right? So look over the next month, and it had to do with hurricanes because we're entering that season. And I can't go through a news feed or any type of feed right now without hurricane this and hurricane that and tropical season kicks in and blah, 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 blah. Okay? So I wasn't surprised to see it there. But the forecast itself annoyed me beyond end. And if we get to the end of this, I'm going to wait until their forecast period ends. And then we will talk because as it stands right, I want to be proven wrong. As it stands right now, it's for a modern era forecast, it's horrible in what it did. All right. And I don't want to call the individual out, and I won't even do it in the episode. I'll talk to it in broad things. And quite frankly, if you're not in my group on LinkedIn, the odds on you seeing it would have been hopefully slim. I hope this person doesn't have a lot of connections that saw this thing. Unless he proves to be right. And then, I will promote him by name, and I'll admit that I'm wrong. But we'll see. Any case, enough of me mildly soapboxing. Let's talk about the Olympics. I hope you've been watching. I've enjoyed it. Some surprises, some not surprises, some new sports that I had no idea would ever be in the Olympics. I'm not sure who decides what goes in the Olympics these days, but some of the stuff that's migrated from the X Games, I think it's really cool that it's there. Some other stuff I look at and go, why is that even in the Olympics, right? But there's probably good reason, and somebody somewhere makes a decision. But I kept hearing about the heat, kind of constantly, maybe not that first week, but certainly the second couple of weeks, and I don't even remember the timeline of the Olympics. I know most of it's captured in 2 weeks, but you've got some stuff that preludes. So most of the prelude time and those early qualification things, I wasn't hearing about it, maybe because there just wasn't many sports going on, but it still seemed like the first couple of days of coverage wasn't hearing about the heat. But let's say the last 10 days, it had gotten to every time the commentators were coming on, they were talking about the heat. Now, it could have also been that some of the things moved outside because early on, there were things like gymnastics and swimming, and all those take place in an environmentally controlled situation. But as we moved more into the things that were track and field, right, or even things like equestrian, but like I mentioned, some of those X Game things, but the canoeing and the rowing and all these other things that moved outside, I kept hearing more and more about the heat. And I also kind of kept hearing these questions or seeing these questions about why are the Olympics held when it's going to be hot? Now, you could argue, whichever kind of tact you want to take, that it's climate change, okay, or that it's just the hot time of the summer. And as I've always said, I never, I grew up in Atlanta. I was glad that the Olympic Games got held in Atlanta. But the time period they picked, I knew it could be hot. And there were a few days that weren't, but it's just one of those things, right? And again, you wonder, should the Olympic Games, the summer or the winter games, actually be held in those kind of, they seem to hold them in the core of that season. And does that really make sense in certain cities and locations that they're being held in? Now, you can't plan years in advance on the weather when these games are awarded. And, they can adjust the time frame maybe to some extent. And I would actually speculate even up until maybe a year out, as we've proven with COVID, or let's say 2, you could adjust the dates. If we were seeing, if we are dealing with a climate change need to shift, it's fine. You could adjust them, okay? But even if in the context of, in thinking about it after the fact, are those the right dates, okay? And so, given that, would it be feasible to do it? Sure. Why don't they? Well, it's the same reason they're scheduled when they are, okay? It's about money. I hate to say that, but it's true. And it's not, don't start reading me saying like somehow that they want the athletes to suffer because it makes good money. It's not what I'm saying. But now that the Olympics, and it's not just because they contain professional athletes now, but the money in sports, and there's a lot of it, is during these big professional seasons. And we have different ones around the globe, but in the U.S., for instance, we have ones that kick off in the end of summer. Okay, and that includes things like American football, and includes things. You have baseball going on throughout the season, but it kind of kicks into its playoff run at that time of year. And in Europe and other parts of the world where regular football or soccer is played, that really goes into overdrive, kicking off right around the start of September. Some of the leagues start a little earlier than that. Okay. But even things like cycling, which is really big in the Olympics, has a professional season, and they tweaked it a little bit, but they've got these big events, right? And the Tour de France got moved up a little bit this year to adjust for that. But they've kind of got three what they would call their majors, right? That they're these grand tours. And so they happen at certain times of the year. And they can't just completely obliterate that schedule. They've got to account for it. So the reason the Olympics happen when they do is primarily it's about, when it is optimal within the professional money-making, whole schedule that makes sense. It's logical, right? I get that. I'm not opposed to that, because if you really could choose it, and it's not just about sports as well. It's about, you can't necessarily get the money that you want to out of these Olympic Games if you're doing it in the end of summer or fall. And we've seen that with some of these when it switches hemispheres and they try to do it. It doesn't exactly play out the same as it does in the core season. In the summertime, and more, probably even more so summer than winter, people can travel during the summer. It's when schools have breaks and they can go to the games when, in the years when we're able to do that stuff. And all of it just plays out differently. So how do the athletes deal with that? And that's really what I was kind of, thinking about. So given that athletes have to deal with it, let's just assume for a moment that nothing's going to change on the other side, as much as I think it can, all right? And we recognize that athletes are going to have to deal with these extremes. And again, it's both summer and winter. You've got this strong heat, humidity, context going on, but even in the Korean Winter Games just a few years ago had extreme cold to the point where it warped equipment, right? It actually torqued things that, things got so cold it just wasn't supposed to be that way. So how do they deal with it? And we actually touched on this a little bit, and there's a lot of science behind it in some episodes I did back in May. And there were two different ones. One was about leveraging weather in therapy, like would you actually use weather to treat your ailments? And the other was talking about this whole adventure tourism, and that was around the time that we had this big deadly event in China with an ultra endurance sort of race that had that major storm that took place. But how do they do it? Because at first glance, you would think, well, this can't be a surprise to them. And it's not, right? Now, for me, and I'll give you an example. I was out just yesterday, doing a hike, okay? And the weather forecast was, let's say it was 30-ish Celsius and, mid-80s Fahrenheit. But there was enough clouds where I was like, okay, it'll be okay. And when I started the hike, it was good. Reasonable. And as I got along, there wasn't enough wind, except when I got on kind of some peaks, which I did do, but I could just feel my shirt just drenching, right, in sweat. Now, I'm a sweater. Not everybody is to the same level I am, but I know how heat impacts me. However, I don't really have time to think about it in the context, so I tend to pick my events, whatever I'm going to do within that context. And it's one of the reasons I'm busy with some work right now, and it's pushed me into training indoors. But one of the reasons I like to train indoors in the summer is I get more consistent performance, and I, quite frankly, avoid the heat. So while I like to get outside and ride my bike or whatever, or hike, I have to be careful to look for the windows of opportunity. And they're not always going to present themselves, so I have that flexibility. But athletes aren't going to have that. Okay? So my way of dealing with it is to avoid it, truly. Now, if I were trying to become a world-class athlete or even trained to be I'm at that age, right, where I can do these master's levels events where being an old guy, I could try it on and try to become, some level, whatever. But even if I were doing that, I don't know if I would train the way I do train or train in these other things, but I would probably incorporate some of these other techniques. And like I said, we talked about one of them. We talked about adventure tourism and one of the things about acclimating. Now, we focused on acclimating with the context of altitude. And, I mentioned in my travels, I did some hiking and it was at a slightly higher altitude. It wasn't, ridiculous or anything. And I could tell the difference. And, there's opportunity to do that. So even in being in that area that had slightly thing, I did some things that were at higher altitude for a couple of days before I went and did the hike itself, knowing that just being out and active in that environment would help to some extent, or in theory would. But let's get back to the athletes. How do they do it? How do they train? Now, put a link in the show notes to a couple of good articles that aren't research articles, but that reference them and that link to them. So this is one of those times when you can do a deep dive if you really want to, because some of the science is truly intriguing on this stuff. Some of it's really fascinating. But let's be clear, they do think about it. And some of them probably have an easier time doing it than others. And it may be one of the things that leads to why certain countries and athletes from certain countries perform better in certain events. Now, some of it's just sheer money thrown at the training apparatus, right? And that's an obvious thing. But certain countries have always performed well in maybe the marathon or other things that involve long distances. But it's not just about, a body structure or anything like that. It's about the weather that they generally are able to train in that may make them better to do it, because they're dealing with these what I might call adverse conditions just in their regular weather, right? And so they're used to it. So part of it is a long-term thing. Part of it is we can acclimate over time. And we've discussed this before. So I grew up in a cold household. The air conditioning was on a lot, and I got used to that. And later, even now, when I'm around people, I still probably tend towards that cold side. But that said, some of that is worn off. But I will tell you, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when I first started kind of not being in that home environment, people thought I was downright crazy how cold I liked it. Okay? But it was what I was used to. It was what my body was used to. But now I do the other thing, and sometimes I even do it to an extreme to help me acclimate out of that. So there'll be times when I might be a little uncomfortable, or I leave the window open a little longer, and I do it to help my body adjust to just being in a warmer climate. And athletes do that too. So athletes may spend years putting themselves in situations or training to sports that favor what their natural conditions are, because you can overcome it. You can train indoors to a certain thing, but if your body on a daily basis is going back to those things, it's still it might wash out the effect. You might train when it's hotter, but if you live in a colder environment, it may not really help. But if you train in a warm environment and live in a warm environment, your body naturally is just going to be more adapt to dealing with things that it considers normal. And our body does change. The physiology of our body changes, how we sweat, how we metabolize. All these things change when we're doing that kind of stuff. So in an ideal world, you train to the sports that are well suited, right? And hopefully you find one that works well for you. But there are other things you can do. And some of them are a little more short-term, and some of them are very short-term. And say in the context of, and this gets into kind of like acclimatizing for a trip, you can either get to somewhere early, and I remember going to Peru years ago and going to Machu Picchu, which is at a higher elevation, and them even talking about get there a few days early and let your body adjust to being at elevation. There are enough kind of intermediate points you can go to where it provides an opportunity for your body just to be, like I was saying, used to being outside at an elevation. And you could do the same thing with heat. And I remember a trip that I took to, an island in the Caribbean one time. I got there, and the first couple of days, I kind of just, I did a little bit of chill, but I also, part of that was just letting my body get used to it. So I did less of the air conditioning, maybe still used a fan, but just let my body warm up so that the rest of the time when I was going to be doing stuff that was a little more active, that my body was generally okay with it. And athletes do that too, right? And what they've proven in some of the research is that ideally, if you're going to try to acclimatize, you would have it 2+ weeks to do it, right? And again, this isn't the same as long-term change in your body, but your body does start to do those same things with how you sweat, how you metabolize, all those sort of things, how it stores heat, right? In just a few weeks. But you can achieve the good percentage of that, somewhere around the 75% range, just in a few days. Now, not everybody has that luxury, right? Not every country, or even every time you take a vacation, can you give it an extra 4 to 6 days that you're in that country, that you're training to that, right? And you may even find that, I don't want to train to that because it's throwing me off my schedule, whatever it is, okay? So that's a reality of the situation. So is there anything more short-term you can do, truly short-term? And the answer is yes. So what we're learning are a few things. One is let's look outside our natural body. Just the clothes that athletes wear, and we've talked about the clothing elements before. They're incorporating different technologies, and it's all designed. And this is particularly true probably in the Winter Games, of making sure in those key areas. So biathlon is an event where they do shooting with it as well, and you got to be dead on, right? So making sure you get really good blood circulation to your hands in those cold environments. Again, the clothes are adapting, the technology is adapting to work with that. But there's also things you can do with your body. And that was what I found interesting in reading these articles, is you can do it both ways. For instance, if you're in a cold environment, all right, you might do things, most of it focuses around raising or lowering your core temperature, and you can do this safely within a context. But I'll give you an idea. Hypothermia is when your body gets really cold, right? And it takes a long time. If you ever watched these things where someone gets really cold and how long it takes to warm the body back up, well, you leverage that, because that can make a huge difference in how you perform. And if you think about it that way, right? If it takes hours for your body to warm up, even under, you put it in blankets or whatever else when you're trying to raise the temperature, you can do the same thing for an athlete. And doing things like taking ice baths, or wearing an ice vest. I saw an athlete doing this in the background in one of the training rooms. They had this big white vest on that was ice vest. Cyclists do it with things that they stick down their back, right? One of those areas where around the neck, and you probably noticed this, we have places on the neck and on the wrist where your main veins and arteries get very close to the surface. And they're trying to dissipate some of that heat. But if you chill them off with cold, it takes that cold back and it circulates it in your body. And you can take advantage of that. So we have these points that are ideal for placement of these things. But you can also just fundamentally just immerse your body, right, in cold, or the reverse, doing saunas or hot baths, right? But I was reading an article about a runner said, I can't believe more people don't do ice baths, because they had some event, I think it was in Canada, some endurance event, I don't know if it was a marathon or a triathlon or whatever else, that like half the people didn't even finish. And of the half that did, the vast majority, or I shouldn't say the vast majority, some large percentage used the ice bath technique to lower their core temperature before they went out and performed in this event. Now, of course, there's probably going to be caveats, and I didn't look into this specifically, but where you have to make sure that you chill your core, which you want to do, but then you've got to still go in and warm up your muscles. And that's a tricky balance, right? But even if you get kind of half the benefit of being cold and the proper benefit of warming up your muscles, you may outperform not only in the context of what you're doing, but to what you're used to. And that's what some of the science is unfolding, is some of these things tell us about when we're better at burning, a certain type of sugars. And that was, I found it interesting, the colder we are, we metabolize differently in terms of our glycemic index and things like that. So there's just, this thing unfolds a whole world of possibilities, not just for these athletes. And that's the beauty of this stuff, is we always push the envelope with the extremes, right? It's like the new adopter thing with technologies. So those people pushing the envelope, those will come back into everyday Joe exercisers like me. And find easier ways, but I've been even talking about it. I'm looking at doing a couple bike races this fall. Races is a strong term, but things that I've not done before. And I'm already thinking about, thankfully, it's going to be hopefully at a cooler time of year, but looking at things like ice vest and other ways to cool that I've never thought about before. And the reason I'm thinking about it is I know how prone I am to overheating and the impacts it causes for me. I don't know. It's kind of interesting, Wild. Let me know what you think. I'd be curious to know if any of you have adopted these technologies, or if you tried technology. It doesn't even have to be in training, that you find work for you in both maybe a medium term, not this lifetime thing, but a medium term and a very brief term attempt to acclimatize to a certain situation. I'd like to know. What is about the weather at gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter there, of course, or Mark_Jelinek on Twitter. And in the meantime, all right, when you're popping on the Olympic Games or you're seeing some goofy ad for something called an ice vest, just remember, there's much more to weather than the weather itself.